Are 1,000 years missing in our history? According to Professor Gunnar Heinsohn, there is, amongst others, and Immanuel Velikovsky. According to Professor Heinsohn, 700 years are missing in the 1st century AD. All the architecture is the same. The basilica, titled as far as digging down and finding the 6th century and then digging a little further in 5th and 4th and so on. 35,000 archaeological sites, and not one of them shows at all. They're all right next to each other. He pretty much just dunks it. It's hard to refute, but they had some good times in the Roman times. Bathroom situation was pretty damn barbaric. One learns the real reason stilts were invented. That's a good one. They'd just have a shat right there out on the street. All right, well, let's start out with a few things. You know, most of us thought that there was this big 2 million year ice age. Some Neanderthals appeared, punctuated with a brief period where a species of humanoid called Cro-Magnon came and apparently went, but not before they were able to go down into the caves all over Europe, paint these ridiculously good paintings. Even though their brains were bigger than modern humans, they disappeared.
Lord, it's a miracle! And vanished like a fart in the wind.
That in itself is a head scratcher for me. Gunnar says that these 3 cataclysms that they are saying happened in the 2nd, 6th, and 9th centuries are actually just 1. 3 have been reported. The evidence does not say that. The Vikings, the sailing people, they didn't get square sails until 700 years after the Romans had them, which doesn't make sense. The Vikings were a sea people. The buildings, the language, the wares, glass, pottery, the same, all over the board. When you cross-reference the study of ancient history, just using mainstream, it's pretty easy to see that there was indeed some major bleepery going on back then. 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. So what we'll do is we'll summarize some key figures and events. We'll look at Joseph Scaliger, the Reformation, and the 30 Years' War. And we'll take a look at some of Femenko's findings. Let's get going. Baalbek. In the valley that gives birth to 2 rivers of Syria, the Orontes flowing to the north and the Litani flowing to the south and west, between the mountains of Lebanon and anti-Lebanon, where roads from Palestine in the south, Damascus in the east, and the sea coast there to Hamath in Upper Syria, lie the ruins of Baalbek. When we compare ruins of Baalbek with those of many ancient cities, which we visited in Italy, Greece, Egypt, and in other parts of Asia and Africa, we cannot help thinking to be the remains of the boldest plan we ever saw attempted in architecture. Is it not strange, then, that the age and the undertaker of the works in which solidity and duration have been so remarkably consulted should be a matter of such obscurity? From the time when this was first written, in the 50s of the 18th century, up until today, nothing was added to dispel the obscurity which envelops the origin of this temple city. The excavations undertaken there brought no solution to the problem of its origin or the nature of its cult. No early inscriptions were found. Throngs of travelers who spend their day wandering among the ruins of a magnificent acropolis go away without having heard what the role of the place was in ancient times, when it was built, or who was the builder. The pyramids, the temples of Karnak or Luxor, the Forum, and Circus Maximus in Rome were erected by builders identity is generally known. The marvelous site in the valley on the junction of roads running to Hamath is a work of anonymous authors in unknown ages. It is as if some mysterious people brought the mighty blocks and placed them in front of the snow-capped Lebanon and went away unnoticed. The inhabitants of the place actually believe that the great stones were brought and put together by Genin, mysterious creatures, intermediate between angels and demons. Solomon's Baalbek. Local tradition, which may be traced to the early Middle Ages, points to a definite period in the past when Baalbek was built, the time of Solomon. Ildrisi, the Arab geographer, wrote, "The great temple city of astonishing appearance was built in the time of Solomon." Ghazwani explained the origin of the edifices of the name of the place by connecting it with Balkis, the legendary queen of the south, and with Solomon. The traveler Robert Wood, who stayed at Baalbek in the 1750s and who published an unsurpassed monograph on its ruins, wrote, "The inhabitants of this country, Mohammedans, Jews, and Christians, all confidently believe that Solomon built both Palmyra and Baalbek." Another traveler who visited Syria in the 80s of the 18th century recorded, "The inhabitants of Baalbek assert that this edifice was constructed by Genin, or genies, in the service of King Solomon. Some scholars looking for Baalbek in the scriptures identified it with Baal-Haman, referred to in the Song of Songs. And again, Baal-Haman is supposed to be another name for Baal-Lath or Baal-Jad. Also, Baal-Zaphon, or Zeus Cassius, was proposed as Baalbek. In this connection, it can be said that, according to the Talmud, Jad, G-A-D, was the name of the planet Jupiter, and Zeus Cassius signifies Jupiter of Lebanon. And Haman was supposed to be a Syrian form of the name Ammon, who, according to the Greek authors, was Zeus Jupiter. All this together, if correct, points toward the cult of Jupiter in Baalbek. And this place had to have been occupied. Jupiter was still close to the Earth and not exactly a gas giant planet yet, but either a hot Jupiter or a sub-brown dwarf star. The skeptics. The study of antiquity started as a debate about fraud. Italian scholar Nanni had published fake sources and caused quite a debate, especially because he also introduced the distinction between primary and secondary sources. This man was not an ordinary fraudster, whose discovery might easily be set aside. It took a long chronological debate to find out what was wrong. In the meantime, scholars learned to look for these sources of sources. Although there were hardly any primary sources from antiquity, we might try to approach them. Although the foundations of a more reliable study of the distant past were being laid, the basic response to unmasking of Nanni was skepsis. The 17th century witnessed the rise of a kind of historical skepsis that is sometimes called a historical Pyrrhonism. Ironically, the idea that antiquity could not be understood was named after a philosopher from the very day and age whose works are lost, Pyrrho of Elis, 360 to 270 BC, the founder of a philosophical system called skepsis. His point of departure had been that we cannot fully understand nature. You can see that lightning strikes, but don't hear the sound at the same moment. The straight pole suddenly looks crooked when you put it into a pool of water. Nature is incomprehensible. The implication is that you cannot establish with absolute certainty whether a statement about it is false or true, and that means that it is impossible to establish a system of ethical precepts, at least not if you want to base it on reality. The true lover of wisdom accepted this uncertainty and postponed his judgment. Nothing was certain. The philosophy of Pyrrho, which was only known indirectly, became incredibly popular in the 16th and 17th centuries. The discovery of the Americas had shown that the ancient authorities were not infallible. The Reformation had shown that religious truths were subject to debate, and wars of religion showed the consequences. Skepsis was the true wisdom, and indeed, skeptical authors like Montaigne are still being read. So how much did we know about antiquity? Protestant authors were quick to point out how many Catholic ideas were just plainly wrong. Those papists believe in purgatory, but for that, there's no biblical evidence. The Church of Rome also venerated the saints, but most legends were invented in medieval times. Secular authors started to ask similar questions. What did we actually know about Homer or Socrates? Other scholars had different questions. How much did we know about antiquity? If most of our manuscripts were medieval, Polizeno's ideas about reconstructing ancient texts from medieval manuscripts were not really well known. How could you establish the difference between legend and fact? What actually was a fact? These questions were put forward in books like
François de la Mauvaise du Peu de Certitude Quilya dans l'Histoire on the little certainty we have about the past, 1668, or Louis de Beaufort's Sur l'incertitude des cinq premiers siècles de l'Histoire romaine,
1738. The uncertainty about the first 5 centuries of Roman history. Often, the examples offered by those authors were quite funny. Why on earth did Romulus have to abduct Sabine women if he really was as handsome as the ancient authors wrote? Much of this criticism was well argued and quite correct. True, Polizeno had created a way to look beyond the medieval copies of the ancient texts. Scaliger had established the basic principles of the study of ancient chronology. As we will see in later installments of this series, the study of inscriptions and coins would more or less corroborate the information of those contested ancient authors. What would a coin have to do with an author? That was the future. In the 17th century, the study of antiquity was in great trouble. The historical purists may have been too skeptical about our knowledge, but they asked a very, very good question. All of the ancient literary works have been burned. Joseph Justus Scaliger, August 5th, 1540 to January 21st, 1609, was a French religious leader and scholar known for expanding the notion of classical history from Greek and ancient Roman history to include Persian, Babylonian, Jewish, ancient Egyptian history. He spent the last 16 years of his life in the Netherlands. After his father's death, he spent 4 years at the University of Paris. For 2 months, he found he was not in a position to profit from the lectures of the greatest Greek scholar of the time. He read Homer in 21 days and went through all other Greek poets, orators, historians, forming a grammar for himself as he went along. Don't we all? From Greek, at the suggestion of Jan Postel, he proceeded to attack Hebrew and then Arabic. Of both, he acquired respectable knowledge. His most important teacher was Jean Durac. He was able not only to impart knowledge, but also kindle enthusiasm in Scaliger. It was to Durac that Scaliger owed his home for the next 30 years of his life. For the 1563, the professor recommended him to Louis de Cassigny, the young lord of La Roche-Posay, as a companion in his travel Roche-Posay on their way. Scaliger formed an unfavorable opinion of the English. Their inhumane disposition and inhospitable treatment of foreigners especially made a negative impression on him. He was also disappointed in finding only a few Greek manuscripts and a few learned men. Later period, he became intimate with Richard Thompson and other Englishmen in the course of his travels. He had become a Protestant.
On his return to France, he spent 3 years with the Chastainers, accompanying them into their different
chateaux
and Poitou, as the calls of the Civil War required. In 1570, he accepted the invitation of Jacques Cujas and proceeded to Valence, jurisprudence under the greatest living jurist. Here he remained 3 years, profiting not only by the lectures but even more by the library of Cujas, which filled no fewer than 7 or 8 rooms and included 500 manuscripts.
The massacre of St. Bartholomew, occurring as he was about to accompany the Bishop of Valence on an embassy to Poland, made Scaliger flee, together with other Huguenots, for Geneva, where he was appointed a professor in the academy. He lectured on the
Organon of Aristotle and the De Finibus of Cicero to much satisfaction for the students, but not appreciating it himself. He hated lecturing, and was bored with the importunities of the fanatical preachers. And in 1574 he returned to France and made
his home for the next 20 years with Chastainer of his life. During this period we have interesting details and notices in the letters Francases Inedites de Joseph Scaliger, edited by
no access to libraries, and frequently separated even from his own books. His life during this period seems most unsuited to study. He had, however, what so few contemporary scholars possessed in leisure and freedom from financial cares.
I know, right?
Academic output. It was during this period of his life that he composed and published his books of historical criticism. His editions of the Catalecta, 1575, of Festus, 1575, of Catalius, Tabelius, and Propertius, 1577, are the work of a man determined to discover the real meaning and force of his author. He was the first to lay down and apply sound rules of criticism and emendation, and to change textual criticism from a series of haphazard guesses into a rational procedure subject to fixed laws. Mark Pattison. These works, while proving Scaliger's right to the foremost place among his contemporaries as Latin scholar and critic, did not go beyond mere scholarship. It was reserved for his edition of Manilius, 1579, and his De Emendatione Temporum, 1583, to revolutionize perceived ideas of ancient chronology, to show the ancient history is not confined to that of the Greeks and Romans, but also comprises that of the Persians, Babylonians, and Egyptians, hitherto neglected, and that the Jews, hitherto treated as a thing apart, and that the historical narratives and fragments of each of these, and their several systems of chronology, must be critically compared. It was this innovation that distinguished Scaliger from contemporary scholars. Neither they nor those who immediately followed seem to have appreciated his innovation. Instead, they valued his elementary criticism and his skill in Greek. His commentary on Manilius is really a treatise in ancient astronomy, and it forms an introduction to this work. Scaliger investigates ancient systems of determining epochs, calendars, and computations of time. Applying the work of Nicholas Copernicus and other modern scientists, he reveals the principle behind these systems. In the remaining 24 years of his life, he expanded his work De Emendatione. He succeeded in reconstructing the lost chronicles of Subius, one of the most valuable ancient documents, especially valuable for ancient chronology. This he printed in 1606 in his Thesaurus Temporum, in which he collected, restored, and arranged every chronological relic extant in Greek or Latin. Scaliger versus the Jesuits. But his enemies were not merely those whose errors he had exposed and whose hostility he had excited by the violence in his language. The results of his methods of historical criticism threatened the Catholic controversialists, the authenticity of many of the documents on which they relied. The Jesuits, who aspired to be the source of all scholarship and criticism, saw the writings and authority of Scaliger as a formidable barrier to their claims. Muret, in the latter part of his life, professed the strictest orthodoxy. Lipsius, what a name. Lipsius. Enemies, therefore, aimed, if not answered his criticisms or to disprove his statements, yet to attack him as a man and to destroy his reputation. I'm sure he had some bones in his claw. It was no easy task, for his moral character was strong. Veronese descent. After several attacks purportedly by the Jesuits, in 1607 a new attempt was made. In 1594 Scaliger had published his Epistiola de Vetuste et Splendor Gentis Scaligere et J.C. Scaligeri Vita. Say that 10 times. In 1601, Gaspar Scipius, then in the service of the Jesuits, published his Scaligere Hypoboliemus, the Supposititious Scaliger, a quarto volume of more than 400 pages. The author purports to point out 500 lies in the Epistiola de Viste of Scaliger, but the main argument of the book is to show the falsity of his pretensions to be of the family of La Scala, and the narrative of his father's early life. No stronger proof, says Pattison, can be given of the impressions produced by this powerful philippic, dedicated to the defamation of an individual, than it had been the source from which the biography of Scaliger, as it now stands in our biographical collections, has mainly flowed. To Scaliger, the publication of Scaligere Hypoboliemus was crushing. Whatever his father Julius had believed, Joseph had never doubted himself to be a prince of Verona, and his Epistola had put forth all that he had heard from his father. He wrote a reply to Scipius entitled Confutatio Fabulae Burdenum. In the opinion of Pattison, as a refutation of Scipius, it is most complete. But there are certainly grounds for dissenting from this judgment. Scaliger purported that Scipius committed more blunders than he corrected, succeed in adducing any proof either of his father's descent from the La Scala family or of any of the events narrated by Julius prior to his arrival at Agen. Nor does Scaliger attempt a refutation of the crucial point, namely, that William, the last prince of Verona, had no son Nicholas, who could have been the alleged grandfather of Julius. Whether complete or not, the Confutio had little success. The attack attributed to the Jesuits was successful. Scipius was wont to boast that his book had killed Scaliger. The Confutatio was Scaliger's last work. 5 months after it appeared on 21st January 1609 at 4 in the morning, he died at Leyden in the arms of his son Heinsius. In his will, Scaliger bequeathed his renowned collection of manuscripts and books to Leiden University Library. Joseph Scaliger.
We shall never know just how many historical documents are in fact counterfeit. History in general goes hand in hand with a history of forgeries. Countless chronicles as well as works of art and literature have been considered authentic for centuries before becoming denounced as counterfeit. A presumed fragment of Cicero's De Consolatione discovered by the famous humanist scholar Sigonius only became identified as a work of the latter 2 centuries after the death of the author. We would probably still believe in Cicero's authorship of said fragment if it hadn't been for the discovery of Sigonius' written confession. Similar examples are rather abundant. The Thespian poet Lucius Verus, who turned out to be a 18th century Dutch scientist by the name of Herkens, plagiarizing from the 16th century Venetian author Carrario. Classical texts sold to the Leipzig library by a certain Schenes in the 1920s and so forth. Think of just how many remain undiscovered. After all, the larger part of the iceberg always remains underwater. However, there may be an equal amount of valid historical documents in existence that were declared forgeries due to their being at odds with the official history. Anatoly Femenko, the prominent mathematician, was the first to apply natural scientific methods to historical data, coming up with a revolutionary theory which implies a radical revision of history as we know it. This theory finally explains such historical oddities as the existence of Christian tabernacles in the pagan town of Pompeii and the Ottoman Turks referred to as Persians in medieval documents. It is rendered in Femenko's fundamental work entitled History, Fiction or Science, which is finally out in English. According to the official version of history, Russia remained under the political and military yoke of the Mongols for many centuries on end. The term Mongol is usually assumed to have always meant the same thing, however. This turns out to be incorrect. The modern interpretation is of a relatively recent origin. Bear in mind that Mongolia didn't exist as an independent state until the early 20th century. The word Mongol simply meant Great One. Popular fiction dealing with conspiracies of one sort or another is actually quite tame as compared to reality. Dan Brown pens a possible conspiracy of the Church against the memory of its originator Jesus. He follows unknowingly in the steps of Martin Luther, who started his Protestant revolution with accusation of papal conspiracy in the matter of Constantine's testament. Well, Martin Luther was right and Constantine's testament was false. Remember, poor Martin Luther had as media outlet nothing better than the doors of the Wittenberg's cathedral. Dan Brown has mass media at his disposal. The Roman Catholic Church, for instance, is involved in a much greater hoax than the most daring writer could possibly conceive of, one that deals with the very foundations of history itself. The above statement is neither an exaggeration, nor a metaphor. Very few people are aware that the BC-AD chronology as we know it was created by a handful of Jesuits in the 16th-17th century, Joseph Scaliger, Dionysius Petavius and their successors. We have grown so accustomed to a timeline that runs through many millennia, from the Egyptian pyramids to the present day, that the mere thought of questioning its veracity seems perfectly preposterous, just like the notion of a rotating Earth must have seemed in the epoch of Galileo Galilei, and just as heretical. But nevertheless, the entire conception of ancient and medieval history known to us today owes its existence to a 16th century Jesuit hoax. A hoax that has finally been exposed with the aid of astronomy, mathematical statistics and modern computational facilities by one of the world's leading mathematicians, the Russian academician Professor Anatoly Femenko. His fundamental work on chronology, history, fiction or science, now available in English, is more fascinating than Dan Brown at his wildest. Yet it is truly a non-fiction work. That goes to say, everything else you have read about history should probably classify as fiction.
The Reformation, specifically referred to as the Protestant Reformation, was a schism in Western Christianity, initiated by Martin Luther and continued by John Calvin, other early Protestant reformers in 16th century Europe. It is usually considered to have started with the publication of the 95 Theses by Martin Luther in 1517 and lasted till the end of the 30 Years' War with the Peace of Westphalia, 1648. Although there had been significant attempts to reform the Catholic Church before Luther, such as Jan Hus, Peter Waldo, and John Wycliffe, Luther is widely acknowledged to have started the Reformation with the 95 Theses. Luther began by criticizing the sale of indulgences, insisting that the Pope had no authority over purgatory and that the Catholic doctrine of the merits of the saints had no foundation in the Bible. The Protestant Reformation, however, would come to incorporate doctrinal changes such as complete reliance on Scripture as the only source of proper belief, sola scriptura, the belief that faith in Jesus and not good works is the only way to obtain God's pardon for sin, sola fide. The core motivation behind these changes was theological, though many other factors played a part, including the rise of nationalism, the Western schism that eroded loyalty to the papacy, the perceived corruption of the Roman Curia, the impact of humanism, the new learning of the Renaissance that questioned much traditional thought. The initial movement within Germany diversified, and other reform impulses arose independently of Luther. The spread of Gutenberg's printing press provided the means for the rapid dissemination of religious materials in the vernacular. The largest groups were the Lutherans and Calvinists. Lutheran churches were founded mostly in Germany, the Baltics, and Scandinavia, while the Reformed ones were founded in Switzerland, Hungary, France, the Netherlands, and Scotland. Yeah, but who funded them? Not founded them. The movement influenced the Church of England decisively after 1547 under Edward VI and Elizabeth I, although the Church of England had been made independent under Henry VIII in the 1530s. There were also Reformation movements throughout continental Europe known as the Radical Reformation, which gave rise to the Anabaptists, Moravian, and other pietistic movements. Radical reformers, besides forming communities outside the state sanction, often implied more extreme doctrinal change, such as the rejection of the tenets of the late antique councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon. The Catholic Church responded with a counter-reformation, initiated by the Council of Trent. Much work in battling Protestantism was done by the well-organized New Order of the Jesuits, of course, in general Northern Europe, with the exception of most of Ireland, Poland, and Lithuania, came under the influence of Protestantism. Southern Europe remained Catholic, while Central Europe was the site of a fierce conflict, culminating in the 30 Years' War, which left it devastated. The 30 Years' War was a war fought primarily in Central Europe between 1618 and 1648, one of the longest and most destructive conflicts in human history, as well as the deadliest European religious war in history. It resulted in 8 million fatalities. Initially a war between various Protestant and Catholic states in the fragmented Holy Roman Empire, it gradually developed into a more general conflict involving most of the great powers. These states employed relatively large mercenary armies, and the war became less about religion and more about continuation of the France-Habsburg rivalry for European political preeminence. The war was preceded by the election of the new Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand II, who tried to impose religious uniformity on its domains, forcing Roman Catholicism on its peoples. The northern Protestant states, angered by the violation of their rights to choose that had been granted in the Peace of Augsburg, banded together to form the Protestant Union. Ferdinand II was a devout Roman Catholic. He was relatively intolerant when compared to his predecessor Rudolf II, who ruled from the largely Protestant city of Prague. Ferdinand's policies were considered strongly pro-Catholic. These events caused widespread fears throughout northern and central Europe. It triggered the Protestant Bohemians living in the then relatively loose dominion of Habsburg Austria to revolt against their nominal ruler, Ferdinand II. After the so-called Prague Defenestration deposed the emperor's representatives in Prague, the Protestant states and the Catholic Habsburgs started gathering allies for war. The Protestant Bohemians ousted the Habsburgs and elected a Calvinist, Frederick V. Elector of Rhenish Palatinate, as the new king of the Kingdom of Bohemia. Frederick took the offer without the support of the Protestant Union. The southern states, mainly Roman Catholic, were angered by this. Led by Bavaria, these states formed the Catholic League to expel Frederick in support of the emperor. The empire soon crushed this perceived rebellion in the Battle of White Mountain, executing leading Czech aristocrats shortly after. The Protestant world condemned the emperor's action. After the atrocities committed in Bohemia, Saxony finally gave its support to the Union and decided to fight back. Sweden, at the time a rising military power, soon intervened in 1630 under its king Gustavus Adolphus, transforming what had been the Dutch rebels in the Netherlands, and the Dutch Republic intervened under the pretext of helping its dynastic Habsburg ally, Austria. No longer able to tolerate the encirclement of two major Habsburg powers on its borders, Catholic France entered the coalition on the side of the Protestants in order to counter the Habsburgs. The 30 Years' War devastated entire regions with famine and disease, resulting in high mortality in the populations of the German and Italian states. The Crown of Bohemia and the southern Netherlands, both mercenary and soldiers in fighting armies, traditionally looted or extorted tribute to get operating funds, which imposed severe hardships on the inhabitants of the occupied territories. The Dutch Republic enjoyed contrasting fortune. It ended its revolt against Spain in 1648, subsequently enjoyed a time of great prosperity and development, known as the Dutch Golden Age, during which it became one of the world's foremost economic naval powers. The 30 Years' War ended with the treaties of Osnabrück and Munster, part of a wider Peace of Westphalia. The war altered the previous political order of European powers. The rise of Bourbon France, the curtailing of Habsburg ambition, and the ascendancy of Sweden as a great power created a new balance of power in the continent, with France emerging from the war strengthened and increasingly dominant in the latter part of the 17th century. As listed here, Spain was interested in the German states because it held territories of Spanish Netherlands in the western part of the empire, and states within Italy that were connected by land through the Spanish Road. The Dutch revolt against Spanish domination during the 1560s, leading to a protracted war of independence that led to a truce only in 1609. France was nearly surrounded by territory controlled by two Habsburg states, Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and feeling threatened, was eager to exert its power against the weaker German states. This dynastic concern overtook religious ones and led to a Catholic France's participation on the otherwise Protestant side of the war. Sweden and Denmark-Norway were interested in gaining control over the northern German states bordering the Baltic Sea. One can really see the origins of America right there in all of that. Because people back then were born with a foot on their throat. They were subjects. They weren't human beings. Anyone who thinks we haven't come a long way really needs to study the Middle Ages to see how good we have it today. We have to definitely make sure that something like this never happens again. We can't let political correctness run amok and threaten our freedoms. They'll see how far they can take it.
The Inquisitions. The word Inquisition refers to harsh or unfair investigations or a series of questions. The Roman Catholic Inquisitions consisted of organizations within the Catholic Church acting on behalf of the Catholic Church, finding, interrogating, and punishing people who disagreed with Roman Catholic theology. We will be discussing two stage or period is known as the Spanish Inquisition, and it began in the beginning of the 15th century. It was launched against Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and others. Medieval Inquisition. The lead-up to the 13th century Inquisition involves the massacre of a group of dissident believers known as the Cathars or Albigenses, who rose up in France in the 11th century. Although there is room for debate as to if the Cathars held to truly heretical teachings, it is a fact that they believed the Roman Catholic Church's sacramental system was evil, and that the Catholic Church was not teaching God's message, which was expressed in the Holy Bible. These people had a very high view of Scripture. They believed that when secular authorities punished heretics, that this was sin. The name Cathar means pure. They sought to live lives of holiness. A 13th century Dominican named Renarius estimated that by his day, there were over 4 million Cathars in over 1,000 cities. Rome perceived this movement as a serious threat which was to be eliminated. In 1179, the Third Lateran Council condemned and anathematized this group, and in 1208, Pope Innocent III decided to launch a vicious crusade against them. This crusade lasted from 1209 to 1229. In a general letter to the faithful, Pope Innocent III angrily wrote, quote, "O most mighty soldiers of Christ, most brave warriors, ye oppose the agents of Antichrist, and ye fight against the servants of the old serpent. Fight for God." This war on the Cathars, though ultimately unsuccessful in and of itself in getting rid of all of them, was nevertheless extremely bloody and ruthless. In one incident, the so-called Battle of Bezij resulted in the slaughter of 10,000 to 20,000 believers. Commenting on this incident, Philip Schaff notes, "Neither age nor sex was spared. Church walls interposed no protection, and 7,000 were put to death in St. Magdalen's Church alone." Pope Innocent III offered his crusade soldiers spiritual reward for the murder of these believers, that is, indulgences for the remission of temporal punishments for sin. This crusade involved many massacres as well as the burning of Cathars who were captured. The clerics within the Cathar movement were ruthlessly eliminated without the benefit of a hearing. In regards to the stronghold of Minerve, 140 Cathar clerics were burnt alive, and the prisoners had their ears, noses, and lips cut off. Commenting on the severity of this crusade, historian Williston Walker notes that Innocent III's efforts, quote, led to 20 years of destructive warfare, in which the power of the southern nobility was shattered and cities and provinces devastated. Another group which was to be eliminated was known as the Waldensians. This movement began in 1177 in Italy and was based on the teachings of Peter Waldo, AD 1140 to 1218. The Waldensian believers affirmed that the Bible was the ultimate authority, and that whatever was not found in Holy Scripture was not to be believed by Christians. These believers practiced memorizing the Bible, and its preachers went out 2 by 2 preaching. They, among other things, rejected masses and prayers for the dead as unscriptural, and denied Rome's doctrine of purgatory. They also refused to venerate saints. Because of these teachings, the Roman Catholic Church enacted what is known as the Episcopal Inquisition, whereby local Catholic bishops would turn unrepentant Bible believers like the Waldensians and others, who refused Rome's teachings, over to civil authorities for punishment. This Episcopal Inquisition was ordered by Pope Lucius III, who reigned from AD 1181 to 1185. On November 4th, 1184, he, in unison with the Council of Verona, issued the bull Ad Obolendum, that is, on abolition, where he condemned and excommunicated the Waldensians and other sects. The bull says, quote, "To abolish the malignity of diverse heresies which are lately sprung up in most parts of the world, it is but fitting that the power committed to the Church should be awakened, that by the concurring assistance of the imperial strength, both the insolence and malpertness of the heretics in their false designs may be crushed. We likewise declare all entertainers and defenders of the said heretics be liable to the same sentence, unless by adjuring his heresy and making satisfaction, he immediately returns to the orthodox faith. We decree him to be left to the sentence of the secular judge, to receive condign, that is deserved punishment, according to the quality of the offense." In the same bull, Pope Lucius III also decreed that the goods and money of the punished heretics be confiscated for the use of the Roman Church. This led to what is known as the First Formal Inquisition in the medieval era. In 1229, the Council of Toulouse issued a decree sanctioning burning at the stake for the punishment of heresy. Likewise, the German Mirror of Saxon laws were compiled in 1235 and ordered the execution of heretics and unbelievers by burning at the stake. With Cathars still around due to the failure of Innocent III's crusade against them, as well as Waldensians and other dissidents walking the lands, Pope Gregory IX, who reigned from AD 1227 to 1247, cemented the Inquisition. He took interrogation, trial, and the punishment of heretics out of the hands of the bishops and placed them into the hands of the monastic orders such as the Franciscans and Dominicans. Everything was now in order for possibly the worst atrocity in all of history to be carried out. By 1244, the Cathars were basically wiped out. Their last refuge was Montségur, France. However, they were overcome by the Inquisition, and the 200 remaining Catholic clerics were there burnt alive. As historian Williston Walker remarks, by means of Inquisition, the Cathars were utterly rooted out by the middle of the 14th century. As time progressed, the Inquisition became crueler and crueler. The final step in configuring the procedure of the Inquisition was made by Pope Innocent IV, when he, in the bull Ad Extrapanda of 1252, authorized the use of brutal torture as a means of extracting a confession from alleged heretics and Bible believers. This practice was also confirmed by later popes such as Alexander IV in 1259 and Pope Clement IV in 1265. Again, during this period, the inquisitors responsible for hearings, confiscation of property, overseeing torture, and burning at the stake were mainly priests within the monastic Dominican and Franciscan orders. In regards to citizens turning in other citizens for interrogation, the Council of Toulouse, in its 18th canon, made it clear that mere suspicion or public rumor of heresy was sufficient for formal Inquisition proceedings to be leveled. This resulted in people falsely being accused of heresy by Catholic citizens they had rivalries with. Others turned in members of their own community in order to appear loyal to Rome and avoid Inquisition themselves. There were even fixed rewards given to spies who specialized in ratting out suspected heretics and Bible believers. In 1239, at Mount Amy, he had 27 burnt to death, or as another account reports, 180. Michael C. Thomset mentions one of the most sadistic and maniacal inquisitors of the 13th century, namely Conrad of Marburg. He investigated heresy in Languedoc and Rhineland. Many placed into his hands were given the choice of speedy confession or death by burning. The Archbishop of Mayence wrote to Pope Gregory IX about this cruel method, and the Pope's response was to identify Conrad as a champion of the Christian faith and to encourage him to continue punishing heretics as well as alleged witches. Conrad was known for stripping naked those he tortured in order to first humiliate them. Now, the previously mentioned Waldensian Bible believers, though hunted vigorously and massacred by Rome during the Inquisition, nevertheless miraculously survived it, unlike the Cathars. Schaff notes that in 1308, Dominican and Franciscan inquisitors hunted and murdered the Waldensians in Bohemia and Poland. However, after facing the Inquisition and enduring the horrors it produced, the Waldensians eventually escaped into the mountain regions of northern Italy in order to avoid total annihilation. They survived over the centuries, and many of them eventually joined the Protestant Reformation movement in the 16th century. It's interesting to note that many of Rome's quote-unquote saints came out of these Dominican and Franciscan orders which were involved with the Inquisition. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Albert the Great were Dominicans, and St. Bonaventure was a Franciscan. It's sickening how Rome would canonize and exalt men who were involved in orders which oversaw the torture and death of massive amounts of Bible believers and others. The medieval Inquisition did not stop there. In AD 1484, Pope Innocent VIII produced the bull Summis Desiderantis Affectibus, wherein he authorized inquisitors to find, try, and murder alleged witches. In this so-called Great Witch Hunt, intellectual arguments meant to persuade the person of their error were not utilized by inquisitors. Instead, the goal was to extract a confession by torture and then murder those rumored to be alleged witches. It was believed by the Catholics that a witch could not cry from pain, and since those tortured cried, the papal inquisitors claimed the devils must have made them cry as a trick to convince everyone they were not a witch. The inquisitors would often shave the bodies of alleged witches, including the private parts, since Catholic superstition at that time said that witches would 1. Hide objects of witchcraft in their hair or private parts, and 2. That witches had a birthmark or scar which would function as a teat to feed milk or blood to imps or the devil himself. Inquisitors would therefore stab alleged witches on their scars or birthmarks with needles, since they claimed a witch would not bleed if their witch's teat was pierced. However, when the people did bleed, the torturers claimed Satan allowed the bleeding to make it appear the person was not a witch. They then resorted to torture such as putting hot boiling fat in the person's eyes, underarms, and thighs, which many times led to infection or death. In Germany, alleged witches who were tortured into confession then had hot irons put on their breasts and arms, their right hand cut off, their body burnt at the stake, and their ashes thrown into the river. Most of these accused witches were simply social outcasts the community did not like. The Spanish Inquisition. Just when one thinks it could not possibly get any worse, they encounter the second phase of Inquisition known as the Spanish Inquisition. In the 1480s, many conversos fled to Portugal to escape Inquisition. However, in 1536, the Inquisition found its way even there. In his work, The Grand Inquisitor's Manual, Jonathan Kirsch relays that, quote, Protestants joined the Jewish and Muslim conversos as principal targets of the Spanish Inquisition. In 1533, a priest who was charged with the seduction of a nun sought to appease the inquisitors by offering them the names of 70 men and women whom he denounced as Lutheran heretics. The first Protestant burned for heresy by the Spanish Inquisition went to the stake in 1540, and 26 of the 30 accused heretics at the Auto at Toledo in 1559 were Protestants. The procedures of Inquisition at this time were as follows, as developed by the Inquisitors General Thomas D. Torquemada. First, there was accusation. Any civilian could level an accusation of heresy or immorality against another, and it would result in a tribunal. Even if no citizen accused anyone, inquisitors could freely accuse citizens. Abuses crept in, since the wealthy were often targeted by inquisitors, since their wealth would be confiscated and go towards funding Inquisition. Second, there was detention. Once accused, the person was detained and their property was seized temporarily, depending on the outcome of the tribunal. Detention often lasted months. Families of the detained were not informed, which often resulted in women and children of the family not being able to survive without the man of the house around. Thirdly, after detention came interrogation. The goal was to gain a confession and pass a sentence. There was no intention of convincing the accused of the error of their alleged heresy or immorality. There were many methods of torture used to gain a confession, including the following. There was the garrucha or strappado, which was a suspension system which had ropes, weights, and pulleys. The victim's arms were tied behind their back. They were hoisted in the air, and then they were dropped. They were stopped in midair right before hitting the ground, so that the weights tied to their ankles caused great pain and dislocation. There was also the taka, which was basically waterboarding, where a cloth was put over the victim's mouth and water poured in, resulting in the victim feeling like they were drowning. Also utilized was the potro, or rack. The victim was placed on this device, and their arms and legs were severely stretched, causing excruciating tearing of the muscles and dislocation. In 1591, Pablo Garcia, the secretary of the Suprema in Madrid, wrote instructions on how this torture was to be carried out. He stated, quote,
according to new chronology, the traditional chronology consists of 4 overlapping copies of the true chronology, shifted back in time by significant intervals with some further revisions. Femenko claims all events and characters conventionally dated earlier than the 11th century are fictional and represent phantom reflections of actual Middle Ages events and characters brought about by intentional or accidental misdatings of historical documents. According to Femenko, this led early chronologists to believe, or choose to believe, that those accounts allegedly happened thousands of years before. The originals, regrettably, and were conveniently lost. For example, the oldest extant manuscripts of monumental treatises on ancient Roman and Greek history, such as Annius and Histories, are conventionally dated AD 1100. More than a full millennium after the events they describe. They did not come to scholars' attention until the 15th century. According to Femenko, the 15th century is probably when these documents were first written. Central to Femenko's new chronology is his claim of the existence of a vast Slav Turk empire, which he called the Russian Horde, which he says played a dominant role in Eurasian history before the 17th century. Various peoples identified in ancient and medieval history, from the Scythians, Huns, Goths, Bulgars, through the Polyan Delubi, Drevlian Pechenegs, to, in more recent times, the Cossacks, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, are nothing but elements of the single Russian horde. For the new chronologists, peoples such as Ukrainians, Belarusians, Mongols, and others who assert their national independence from Russia are suffering from historical delusion. Femenko claims that the most probable prototype of the historical Jesus was Andronicus I Komnenos, allegedly AD 1152 to 1185, the emperor of Byzantium, known for his failed reforms, his traits and deeds, reflected in biographies of many real and imaginary persons. The historical Jesus is a composite figure and reflection of the Old Testament prophet Elijah, 850 to 800 BC, ? Pope Gregory VII, 1020, ? 1085. Saint Basil, Caesarea, 330 to 379, and even Li Yuanhao, also known as Emperor Jingzong, or Son of Heaven, Emperor of Western Qi, who reigned in 1032 to 1048, Euclides, Bacchus, and Dionysus. Femenko explains the seemingly vast differences in the biographies of these figures as resulting from differences in languages, points to view and time frame of the authors of said accounts and biographies. He claims that the historical Jesus may have been born in 1152 and was crucified around 1185 on Joshua's Hill overlooking the Bosphorus. Femenko also merges the cities and histories of Jerusalem, Rome, and Troy into New Rome, which equals Gospel Jerusalem in the 12th and 13th centuries, which equals Troy, which equals Yoros Castle. To the south of Yoros Castle is Joshua's Hill, which Femenko alleges is the hill cavalry depicted in the Bible. Femenko claims the Hagia Sophia is actually the biblical Temple of Solomon. He identifies Solomon as the Sultan of the Sultan of Suleiman the Magnificent, 1494 to 1566. On the other hand, according to Femenko, the word Rome, in parentheses, is a placeholder and can signify any one of several different cities and kingdoms. He claims the first Rome, or ancient Rome, or Mizraim,
is an ancient Egyptian kingdom in the delta of the Nile, with its capital in Alexandria.
The second and most famous New Rome is Constantinople. The third Rome is constituted by three different cities: Constantinople again, Rome in Italy, and Moscow. According to his claims, Rome in Italy was founded around AD 1380 by Aeneas, and Moscow can refer to different cities at different times. And the word Israel did not define a state, even not a territory, but people fighting for God. For example, French St. Louis and English Elizabeth called themselves the King and Queen of Israel.
He claims the parallelism between John the Baptist, Jesus, the Old Testament prophets, implies that the New Testament was written before the Old. Femenko claims that the Bible was being written until the Council of Trent, 1543 to 1565, when the list of canonical books was established, and all apocryphal books were ordered to be destroyed. Femenko also claims that Plato and Plotinus are one and the same person. According to him, some texts by or about Pletho are misdated and believed to be texts by or about Plotinus or Plato. He claims similar duplicates for Dionysius the Areopagite and Dionysius Patavius. He claims Florence and the House of Medici bankrolled an important role in the magnificent Roman and Greek past. Femenko and his colleagues make numerous claims. Historians and translators often assign different dates for the same accounts in historical events, creating multiple phantom copies, and that these events are often misdated by centuries or even millennia and end up incorporated in conventional chronology. And this chronology was incorporated by Joseph Justus Scaliger in the Evsili Pampili and the Thesaurus Temporum 1583 and 1606. In his chronology, the events of the New Testaments, Femenko believes there is no reliable written record of human events before the 11th century, because most of our knowledge of earlier cultures is based on text or copies of text that date from after that era. From that point on, chroniclers, primarily learned religious scholars, use supposition, arbitrary consensus, to fix the dates of key events in history. In doing so, they grafted recent occurrences onto earlier dates, sometimes unwittingly, sometimes perniciously, thus creating numerous historical duplicates. History appears to repeat itself, Femenko suggests, because it is thoroughly plagiarized. In this chronology, the events of the New Testament precede those of the Old Testament, and in any case, most of the stories are concocted to reflect later incidents. Joan of Arc was a model for the biblical character Deborah. Jesus Christ was crucified in Constantinople in 1086. Ancient Egypt, Rome, and Greece were fashioned by Renaissance writers and artists. The time of the pharaohs, Femenko suggests, may have lasted into the 1700s. I often wondered that. Aristotle instructed Alexander the Great, who was a czar in Moscow in the 1400s. Early English history, from the accepted names and dates to the apocryphal legends of a post-Roman King Arthur, is actually a carbon copy of 4th century Byzantium, which itself a fiction based on late medieval events. Yeah, but mainstream, you'll never get mainstream to pay attention to that. They'll just poo-poo it like they do everything else. Speaking of carbon, don't bother relying on carbon dating or other scientific chronological methods. Femenko says they are premised on old dating system and hence thoroughly corrupted. Does this sound uncanny? Well, a little bit, but you know what? I think it hasn't been anywhere near as long as they say it is since our last cataclysm. For all we know, it could have been 200 or 300 years ago. We really don't know. We only know what we have. And what he's saying is nothing exists after before 1100 AD. So, I mean, it's anybody's guess what could have happened up till then. Crazy. He's a tad nationalistic, though. So, you know, I don't know what's driving his motivation. This version of events is sustainable by hard facts and logic, validated by new astronomical research and statistical analysis of ancient sources, but it's a corrupted cosmology. To a greater extent than everything you may have read and heard about history before. See, this is another example of someone who's a maverick in their field, but taking it for granted that mainstream cosmology is correct. That's why they call it the queen of the sciences. And in short, he argues that Bolderadian copies without an original. We are in a matrix with medieval rules. These rules are explained in a 7-volume corpus by Femenko, of course. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. The late Russian social critic, Alexander Zinoviev, provided the foreword to this masterwork. The entire history of humanity up until the 17th century is a forgery of global proportions, he wrote, a falsification as deliberate as it is universal. It sounds insane, and it is derided by most modern scholars as pseudo-history. Orwell's old cliché about control of the past may come as a shock to young first-time readers of 1984, but to chronologists, it's old hat. Historical chronology, wrote the German historian Dietrich Hermann Hegzwitsch in 1854, is necessary to furnish a principle of order and to promote the orderly arrangements of social life. When you get older, you come full circle and you realize that all that don't mean shit. It's better to be home, which is sweet sanctuary. The murkiness of humanity's timeline is an age-old problem. Absent a solution, society itself cannot function. Entire religious schisms turn on how church fathers set the dates for certain biblical events. This stuff is important. Indeed it is. Mainstream cosmology is corrupt. Have a champagne taste and a Kool-Aid pocketbook.
One might wonder why we should want to revise the chronology of ancient history today and base our revision on new empirical statistical methods. It would be worthwhile to remind the reader that in the 16th and 17th century, the chronology
was considered to be a subdivision of mathematics, archaeological dating, dendrochronological dating, paleographical dating, numismatic dating, carbon dating, and other methods dating of ancient sources and artifacts known today are erroneous, non-exact, or dependent on modern chronology.
No single document in existence can be reliably dated earlier than the 11th century. Most ancient artifacts may find other than consensual explanation. Histories of ancient Rome, Greece, and Egypt were crafted during the Renaissance by humanists and clergy, mostly on the basis of documents of their own making. The Old Testament represents a rendition of events of the 14th to 16th centuries AD in Europe and Byzantium, containing prophecies about future events related in the New Testament, a rendition of events of AD 1152 and 1185. The history of religions runs as follows. The pre-Christian period, before the 11th century, the birth of Jesus. Bacchic Christianity, 11th and 12th centuries, before and after the life of Jesus. Christianity, 12th to 16th centuries, and its subsequent mutations into Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism, Judaism, and Islam. The Alchemist of Claudius Ptolemy, traditionally dated to be around AD 150 and considered the cornerstone of classical astronomy, was compiled in the 16th and 17th centuries from astronomical data of the 9th to 16th centuries. 37 complete Egyptian horoscopes found in Dendera, Esna, and other temples have unique valid astronomical solutions, with dates ranging from AD 1000 up to as late as AD 1700. The vocabulary of Egyptian astronomical symbols, once applied to horoscopes from temples, allows for extraction of unique dates of eclipses. Astronomical data therein contained is sufficient for unique dating. There are symbols allowing for astronomical interpretations, and the symbols do not change from one temple horoscope to another. The horoscopes from temples sufficient contain data about eclipses visible, eclipses visible in Egypt, allowing their exact pinpointing of the time axis. The book of Revelation as we know it contains a horoscope dated to 25th September, 10th of October, 1486, compiled by Kabbalist
Johannes Riachlen.
Bizarre phraseology which NASA has never satisfactorily explained. One of the most obvious and most heard euphemisms, of course, is the eagle has landed, and everyone associated that with the eagle symbol of America. But in fact, the eagle is a Masonic symbol, because it is really, what is being referred to is really the double eagle of Freemasonry and not the bald eagle of America. The double eagle is a very famous symbol of Freemasonry. It was originally the emblem of the Habsburg dynasty of Europe, a very powerful set of oligarchs and royalty that still exist and are responsible for innumerable wars and dynastic rivalries. Now in the Koran, chapter 9:11 no less, it says, "For it is written that a son of Arabia would awaken a fearsome eagle. The wrath of the eagle would be felt throughout the lands of Allah."
Ages and Chaos.
Emanuel Velikovsky. Velikovsky claimed in his book that the historians of ancient Egypt and ancient Israel are 5 centuries out of step. He began by claiming that the Exodus took place not, as Orthodoxy has it, at some point during the New Kingdom, but at the fall of the Middle Kingdom. He identifies the Hyksos with the biblical Amalekites, the biblical Queen of Sheba with the Egyptian Queen Hatshepsut, the biblical Shishak, king of Egypt, with Pharaoh Thutmose III, and claims that the Egyptian Amarna letters from the late 18th dynasty describe events from the kingdom of Israel and Judah, roughly the time of King Ahab. Some specific proposals included: there's synchronizing the Ipuwer papyrus from the beginning of Egypt's second intermediate period with the biblical Exodus. The Ipuwer papyrus was conventionally dated to approximately 350 years before the conventional date of the Exodus, 1450 BCE.
There are those that say Akhenaten was Moses. The words Moses and Moses are awful close, and I think that might have been more of a title. I don't know, but if Akhenaten was Moses, it would make perfect sense.
The concept of alter egos, historical figures who were known by different names in 2 different sources, Egyptian and Greek, and were conventionally considered to be entirely different people living in different centuries, but were proposed by Velikovsky to be actually erroneously dated accounts of the same individuals and events. Hatshepsut equals the Queen of Sheba. Solomon's kingdom equals the land of Punt. Thutmose III equals King Shishak, who sacked Jerusalem. Separating Horemheb and the 19th dynasty pharaohs from the earlier 18th dynasty pharaohs instead of the 22nd through 25th dynasties followed upon the earlier part of the 18th, leading down to the Assyrian invasions of the early 7th century BCE. So Velikovsky was saying this in 1945. Be wary of mathematicians, especially when they tell the truth. St. Augustine. He who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Orwell. According to sources, the imperial cult were the bigwigs, or movers and shakers of the day. They had ceremonies. They had many centers that later transformed into the Christian cult. After the change of dynasties, they felt the need to create their own mythology. They did it through the writing of the Gospels, and they deified Titus, the Roman emperor. The theological structure in the Gospels is the same one that was presented to the Roman Senate. Titus was declared the Son of God. The Arch of Titus, that still stands today, is inscribed to the divine Titus, Son of God. They spread their propaganda using the media of the day, the roads of Rome. The richest family in the world at the time, the Alexanders, funded this campaign. Who were the Alexanders? They were a Jewish family that served as tax collectors in Egypt. One of the members of the Alexander family was Philo of Alexandria, who was writing and combining Jewish beliefs as well as Roman and Greek pagan beliefs of the day. The symbols of paganism were transferred into the church. For example, the title of the chief pontiff of Rome was transferred into the Roman Catholic Church. And I have to admit, it's so confusing that it would be impossible for someone to confuse the issue. You got this group saying this, you got that group saying that, you got this group saying that, and then you got the lunatic fringe saying whatever comes to mind. How can one sort out what is what in this mess? History. Mostly false events, unimportant, brought about by rulers, mostly knaves, and soldiers, mostly fools. Not until lions have their historian. The tale of the hunt will always favor the hunter. Belief is the enemy of knowing. Epistemology and justice. Sacred is deathless. Once a person stands for something, he will create enemies. To be violent and arrogant, one must be ignorant of the universe. You know, they say that Catholic religion is sun worship, but there's a whole lot of Saturn iconography in their sun worship. I think it's the first sun that they worship, their black robes. Both sides aren't without their propaganda. The truth is probably so far out, it would be hard to believe. You know, I bet Americans are the most brainwashed, propagandized people on the face of the earth. Our mainstream media makes Joseph Goebbels look like a kindergartner with a crayon, and they haul out the biggest lies. Everything that NASA has found on these planets, we haven't the first clue of. We can guess, and we got some pretty good guessers, but we don't really know. But some of the things that I've seen are very tantalizing. They lead me to believe that the Earth is an outpost, and there's another human race on another planet going around another star, and they're probably thousands of years ahead of us. And those little grays that they see, those are probably androids just making sure we don't blow ourselves to kingdom come. As far as our ancient history, it's like everything else. It's just all blurred and messed up. Situation normal, all bleeped up. Or FUBAR.
So when the papal forces came here to invade, they were operating under the doctrine of discovery, which stated that the number 13 was the number of the devil, and that all mathematics not endorsed by the church was officially devil worship. So according to that doctrine, unfortunately, all Native American civilization was declared satanic, and the conquerors were given the right to slaughter every Native American they knew who could count.
There's always been old maps, and there's always been a history of our planet that's been hidden.
I've come to the conclusion after many, many years of research that we're not simply dealing with UFOs. That's a small thing. If that had been the whole story, our government would probably have told us this a long time ago.
And for whatever reason, there are those who have their own intent to keep mysteries from the people. And this is why I feel the earth is all out of whack and people are out of whack, because the power of what we live on and who we are and our heritage is not being spoken of.
Some intelligences, some advanced, I mean very advanced intelligences that appear to have multidimensional source, origin. Now, I can't even tell you what the hell that means. Same single story is told again and again and again. We are a created hybrid race. We are the product of some vast laboratory of some kind. And that apparently the human race is not an accident. We're not some cosmic joke. We didn't just happen. The Darwinian theory of how we evolved from the apes doesn't even begin to hold water. I no longer investigate UFOs landing. I no longer investigate abductions, contacts, landing marks, and any of that. I have files that are filled with this kind of information.
When we as human beings think, where did it all start from? I don't think there's a single human being who can scientifically prove and say this was the case. We have hypotheses and we have a right to think whatever we want. But the main thing is that we realize that we are spirits, we are energy.
This involves who we are, as a race, as a species. How did we get here? Why are we here? And where are we going?
And you go into the Southwest, those tribes down there have had 400 years or more contact with the Spanish church. They've even picked up skinwalkers, they picked up evil spirits. We don't have a devil, we don't have it. But we don't have this force because our concept of the Creator doesn't make such a thing. I've never seen a devil. I don't care if the white man believes in it. That's what the white man believes in. That doesn't mean that I have to believe in it. I believe in what I see. Have I ever seen the Creator? I've never seen the Creator directly. I don't expect to. But I see every day what the Creator makes. I can pick up a bouquet of flowers and hold that bouquet of flowers. I know the Great Spirit is kind and is very artistic. Bees come and sniff the flowers. They make honey. Birds sing. Those are all beautiful expressions of this Creator. So the Great Spirit gave me my life. Why should I fear it? I live because of the Creator. So I don't fear Creator. I don't fear evil spirits. And yet we have contact into the spirit world. And that is what is powerful.
All the evil deeds that have been done throughout the past is puzzling to me. Human beings are the only beings that know we're going to die on Earth. Yet they show no concern at all for what kind of legacy they leave. People are smart. They figure things out. They should know that. I guess what would be the worst thing for me would be what kind of legacy I left. I would think that these people being in the positions they were in would think the same thing. They thought nothing of life at all. That's puzzling. I was raised by a Christian mother and Christian father. I never saw anything like that. It was all, peace and love and all that. But man, what an ugly past it comes from. Once one thing opens your eyes, then everything becomes suspect. And then they start dropping like flies. In all my life, I've only seen one leader in history that cared about what kind of legacy he left. Kennedy was president. America was loved all over the world. It sure isn't like that anymore. What happened? I made this video over a year ago, so I tried to leave it in as much of its original form as I could.
free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Newton comes up with the only explanation he can think of, given the knowledge he has. As knowledge is acquired, better information is available, and more realistic explanations can be offered. If this is an electric discharge crater, we live in an electric universe. And again, the sun is not a giant nuclear reactor. It's basically a ball of electricity. It's not actually that hot, close to. About 6,000 degrees. It's not very hot. Because if it was, the closer you got to it, the hotter you'd get. And you don't. It is powerful. It's a huge thing, the sun. But if it's an electric universe we live in, the whole of celestial mechanics needs to be rethought. This was one of the points that Velikovsky came up with.
And I stopped this book with the catastrophe that divides the Bronze Age from the Iron Age. If you believe in a Greek Dark Age, you know that the Bronze Age comes to an end around 1100 BCE. If you don't believe in it, as I do not, it ends around 600 BCE. And if you are a nerd for stratigraphy, it may even end later, like 400, 350 BCE. Anyway, it will end before the first millennium AD, after Christ CE, whatever you prefer to call it. And I have to say today that the major flaw of this book was ending in the first millennium BCE and not looking carefully enough at the first millennium AD. Of course, I was aware of the crises in the first millennium, hitting the Roman Empire, but I belong to those who wrote about these crises as caused by demographical or by economical factors. This was the major flaw of thinking at that time, and I try to remedy this today. I worked on the problems of the first millennium AD since around 65 months, and we will look at the events that took place there right away. We start with a summary made by Wolf Liebeschütz. Now, if you start doubting that we are dealing with three different strikes with very little overlap, if you believe it may have been just a single strike, of course, you are confronted with chronology. The strikes are divided over 700 years, and to imagine the three strikes as just one will force you to cut 700 years out of the first millennium. This sounds bizarre. It sounds just impossible. So when I started to understand the chronology of the first millennium, what struck me most is that from antiquity, 1st to 3rd century, to late antiquity, 4th to 6th century, and then to the early Middle Ages, 8th to 10th century, you always have the same architecture, the same Roman basilica architecture. There is no evolution whatsoever in the arts, in the sciences, in the architecture, as I said, and moreover in the language too. Latin of the 2nd century is indistinguishable from Latin of the 9th century. So it's very strange, because before antiquity and after the early Middle Ages, you have evolution, you have changes. Within the periods, you have evolution. But between the periods, you have a standstill of cultural evolution that just appears to be absolutely impossible. So what to do? You ask yourself, is there any site in Europe or in the Near East, is there any site where you have traces of these three steps of civilization: antiquity, late antiquity, early antiquity? If you have them anywhere superimposed on top of each other, you have a stratum for antiquity, one from late antiquity, and one for the early Middle Ages, superimposed on each other. So when you have the 10th century, you dig down and you find the 5th century or 6th century, and you dig down and you find the 2nd and 3rd century, always with this type of architecture. If you look for such a site, the selection is immense. So we know about 5,000 Roman towns and cities, 20 to 25,000 large agricultural estates, villa rustica. And further east, we know about at least 5,000 Chernyakov sites. They are outside of the empire. They are located about here. So we are looking at least 35,000 sites to find those that have these three periods: antiquity, late antiquity, and the early Middle Ages superimposed on each other. And when I started looking, I thought there would be thousands. Then I thought there would be hundreds. And then I thought there would be maybe 50. Now I know there is not a single such site.
Among the Jews, I mean, he was massive. It was a very messianic century. Because the year 1666 was on its way, the Christians thought Jesus was coming back, and there was a particular date which was auspicious in the Jewish calendar, where a lot of people thought it may be the date of the return of the Messiah. And this guy, Shabbatai Zevi, he was alive at that time. He was a renowned Kabbalist. You know, we said that these people focused very much on the Talmud, and a part of the Talmud specifically, Kabbalah. And the Kabbalah was a general set of rules that used to be there, and different rabbis and great scholars, sages among the Jewish population would come out with their own versions of it. And one man, in the middle of the 16th century, produced a version of Kabbalah which has spawned the entire Jewish Messianic movement for the last 400 years.
And you said 1666 was the Christian year that they all thought they were going to see a return, and the Jews had had their own specific Jewish date that kind of coincided with some messianic prophecy that they would bring forward a Messiah. And didn't they say that Shabbatai Zevi was the Messiah for a while?
Well, the Shabbatai Zevi was a follower of the Kabbalah, of this particular type of Kabbalah. This is the one which has brought all Messianic movements through Judaism, and it's known as the Lurian Kabbalah, after Isaac ben Solomon Luria. And this man invented a twist, a spin on the Kabbalah, a new interpretation and a new way of putting it together, and some new practices, spiritual practices. He was known among the community, by the way, as the Sacred Lion, because he was apparently able to do conjuring tricks, magic tricks with whatever he'd learned, or he appeared to the people to have special powers, and it influenced them. And I'll give you a quote about this man now from the Encyclopedia Judaica. It says of the Lurian Kabbalah, "In no small measure it prepared the ground for the messianic ferment of the Shabbatian movement." So you can't get a better authority than that. And it's saying this Kabbalah, not the Kabbalah that you go and buy down at the bookstore, but this particular one is the one where all the magic tricks, all the conjuring appears from. This version of the Kabbalah. And what happened was that Sabbatai Zevi was just like any other rabbi in that area of the world, about 50 to 70 years now after the time of Isaac ben Solomon. Isaac ben Solomon wouldn't allow anybody to teach his version of the Kabbalah while he was alive. After he died, he gave permission to his disciples and students who'd got to a certain stage to teach other people. So it was in limited form. What happened with the Sabbatian movement, Sabbatai Zevi, he started having visions. He was practicing this system and he started having visions. He started being able to do conjuring tricks himself. Other people who were practicing the same thing as him started to have visions about Sabbatai Zevi being the Messiah. And these guys were great rabbis and spiritual leaders in the community, and they were all having these dreams and visions about him. So it was very much adding to the fervor of the time. And he himself, they say that he didn't believe it to start with and came to believe. I mean, the man is, again, one of these things that is whitewashed. You know, they try to say, oh, it wasn't really that important and he was just an embarrassment in the history of Judaism. And the way that people were thinking this man was the Messiah and the influence that he had as a result. So the Caliph actually had him arrested. This is a very important part of his history.
Right.
And indeed, Darrell, this is the crux of the matter. The beliefs of the Lurian Kabbalah and the practice of the Sabbatian movement is the start of Crypto-Judaism. The Crypto-Jew and Crypto-Judaism. Crypto-Judaism, tell everybody you believe one thing, really you practice another and believe another. Crypto-Jew, tell everybody you're a Muslim, really you're a Jew. Tell everybody you're a Christian, really you're a Jew. And you can do this as far as they were concerned. It was part of the teachings of the Messiah, Sabbatai Zevi. So as far as they're concerned, the Messiah himself has given them not only permission but instruction to start behaving like this. The Donmei were used at the time when they needed to overthrow the Caliph, to prepare the way for the First World War and the establishment of the Jewish national homeland in Palestine, Zionism. That's when the Jews actually went back and did a deal with the Donmei and said, and by this, and I'm using the term Jews loosely here because, as you'll see, if you study the history, you'll see they were Sabbatians. Another group of Sabbatians went to them and said, we need you to organize a movement. They were living in Salonika at that time. They said, go into Turkey and overthrow the Caliph. And they went in there and they established Freemasonic lodges, the first Freemasonic lodges in Turkey. And through operating through those lodges over a period of time, they were able to overthrow the Turkish Caliphate.
Now, the Masonic lodges you're discussing, we're going to go to this now because I want to bring up what started now after Sabbatai Zevi's original failure. His movement actually morphed into several others, and one of them was, and it says so on a site that I read about it, that it ended up morphing into the Frankist movement, didn't it?
Jacob Frank himself said, Sabbatai Zevi was Messiah, and I myself am Messiah, and all three of us are manifestations of God himself. So, to get the timing here, Frank died in 1791, okay? That's when he died. And bear in mind that Isaac ben Solomon was pushing his Lurial Kabbalah around in around the 1560s. So we can see there that when people try to tell us this movement died with Sabbatai Zevi, it's entirely untrue. Because now, today, these people who built up a following of very wealthy Jews and powerful Jews, bankers and such like, by saying, don't worry, we're not extremists and you don't have to swap your wife with anybody, and because they're involved in orgiastic wife swapping and all sorts of strange practices, the Sabbatians. They said, look, you don't have to worry about that. With us, you can just practice normal Judaism and we'll give you this particular spin.
We know that a large fortune was passed on from father to son, and it actually started back, I think, back in the 14th and 15th centuries. I mean, huge fortunes, and it actually was the seed money for fortunes such as Warburg and fortunes such as Rothschild. How does that fit into this story?
Well, what we have as part of the Sabbatean movement, we find that under Frank, towards the end of his life, he instructed his disciples to go to Poland, Warsaw in fact, and to build factories and to get established in business and to start making big money. And also, according to Encyclopedia Judaica again, his followers became active in the Masonic organizations in Poland too. The Sabbatean movement is very, very deep, and these were openly Frankist in their beliefs, again involved in all the orgiastic wife swapping and all the other strange practices that they have, which most Jews would say, oh, all of this stopped with the Sabbatean movement under Sabbatai Zevi. But we can actually demonstrate that this was still being practiced in the middle of the 19th century, and even the early 20th century, they were still visible. Now, the other thing about Frank, Jacob Frank, is that is the man who told Adam Weishaupt to found the Illuminati, the Bavarian Illuminati.
Now, at this time, 1790, the Rothschilds were already well established as nation crushers, and they had already backed the Jacobins in their revolt against the King of France. They had already begun with dealings with Cromwell and the rest. I mean, how was their activity monitored by these people, and where did they come in with all this money?
Okay, well, Adam Weishaupt took his money from Rothschilds in founding the Illuminati in Bavaria. He was financed by the Rothschild, but the instruction came from Jacob Frank himself. So,
now, the Rothschilds had already been rich for a generation already, and I mean, were they handed their fortune, or did they build it themselves, or was it a mix of both? Or, I mean, who gave them their start over in Frankfurt and Hanover?
Their start came through the history of them coming from families which were involved in the financing of trade. They were always involved in trade finance, which goes back, you know, all the way to the very early days of the settlements, where people were traveling through the middle of the Khazaria, coming in and out. It was the Jews who were present in Khazaria at that time, before their embracing Judaism, were the ones who financed the business. They put money up because, of course, the Jews were money lenders of old. They were, because they could charge interest on it. The Muslims didn't lend on interest, and the Christians wouldn't lend on interest, but the Jews would, you see. So they were prepared to risk their money on a loan to finance transactions. And so mainly from money lending is how, and trade finance is the way that the Rothschilds began to build their fortune. The Battle of Waterloo, I don't know if you know that.
Yes, story. I do. I know they imploded the stock market and then bought it all back at pennies on the pound.
Indeed, they sent a false messenger into the London Stock Exchange. In today's day and age, you would go to jail for doing this, of course. But they sent a messenger in saying that the British had lost the Battle of Waterloo. The stock market plummeted. He bought everything up for pennies. And then the real messengers arrived and said that they'd won, and the stock exchange went up and he sold it all for cash, which he swapped then for gold. That was just, I mean, if you have people who are prepared to cheat, then you, and steal from people and defraud people, then you can probably be quite successful in this world. And the thing about the Kabbalah is that it does say that there is no such thing as evil. You know, these people have a belief that says evil is in the mind of the Gentile. And it's only because of their lack of spiritual enlightenment that they believe that people are evil or that evil exists. But if they were of a better mind, they would not see these things as evil. It comes down to these teachings from Kabbalah, which says that you know, in this world there is no evil. Or it even says in another slightly different spin on the same thing, it says the evil in the world is there from the left hand of God. And because God has a left hand where all evil comes from, if we work evil in the world, we are doing God's work in the world. We're working his left hand. This is absolutely true. Anybody can study the Kabbalah, and they will find that these are core teachings, fundamental, not extreme to one side. These are very, very central to the core, because they say God is infinite, without personality, and therefore evil exists, and they use the Kabbalah as the basis for understanding evil in the world, and they say it exists, but it's not really evil. And specifically, the Lurian Kabbalah. And you'll find that these people believe the same thing throughout time.
And so, with a good measure of help by the well-financed occult brotherhoods, such as the Rosicrucians and Freemasons, the Royal Society was established as the first official organization dedicated to the advancement of scientific understanding.
The terminology and the different treats of what the knowledge of the Druids were at that time.
And remember we said that Atomism and Christianity and all these secret societies are basically unworthy preservers of these ancient theological motifs?
Mm-hmm.
Right, so when you look into Masonry, you'll see the checkerboard that represents the squares of night and day, and also ignorance and knowledge.
Right.
You'll see the luminaries, representing the different cults of the ancient world, again, which they are, unworthy descendants of.
Yes.
And you see the three columns, which is also employed in state buildings and so on. Those represent the three, trees. It's number 3. It represents the 3 orders of Druidism.
Right, yeah. And 3 and 3, of course, is very similar, the words.
That's right. Threshold, you see. All of this is very, very important. A whole elaborate study we've done in our DVDs and books on these symbols for people who are not familiar with them. Very, very important to notice these pillars in architecture.
Then we have the Freemasonic structure, the classic square and the compass here with the G in the middle, of course.
That's right. Went into this with Alex Jones, talking about that if you look at the degree ceremonies, they appear to have many Judaic names, like Knight of the Kadosh and Knight of the Serpent, and the Keepers of the Secret, and of Solomon, you see?
Yeah.
And I have so many quotes in the coming DVD that show you that all Freemasonry bows its head to the old, Judaic system. And all that needs to be borne in mind, you see, is that when you hear things like Judaic system or Hebrew system, you just got to put the word atonist in its place, and then all stands explained.
The G.
But what I want to address with this Masonic symbol at this point is the letter G that you see on Masonry.
Yeah.
This is from the Gaionim tradition.
Right.
Remember we said the oral tradition linking to the Zadokites and Moses, secret oral tradition handed down to the tribes of Judah?
Yeah.
The tribes of Israel wanted nothing to do with it. They leave, they move on, they say, look, we're content with just this, and they broke the covenant. And then you have the hardcore Gaionim, and then these are the progenitors of Masonry. That is why Masonry used the capital G. It's the 7th letter of the alphabet. It has a whole mystery attached to it in itself. Yeah. But in lowercase, the G looks like a serpent.
Show the next image there, Frederick. You can take a look at that.
Remember that we talked about how even the symbol of the cross meant serpent?
Yeah.
The G in its lowercase is a cryptic, symbol, a cryptic image. It's an insignia. And that's why when you find it on Masonry, you got to realize you're talking Dragon Court, Brotherhood of the Snake, again, going back to the pharaohs again, going back to the whole idea of the Atonists and the kings of the ancient world who wore the serpent, headdress.
Yes, absolutely.
The circlet, and that goes right back to the Egypt, not only to India with Shiva, but right into Ireland. You see the symbol of the serpent and even the words that relate to this sort of royalty. They're still in business today.
Absolutely. And
but what they tend to do, just like that previous image where you showed the G on the gene trust, it's put there as a symbol, but we don't see it with the left brain. Same thing with the communist flag, for instance. How many people have seen the communist flag? They don't even realize that is Druidic symbolism there and Masonic symbolism in one. You not only have the red, which represents the royals of the ancient world, see the Edomites, and this whole idea of the red square, the red carpet.
Yeah.
But the hammer and sickle is the shape of a G, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. There we go. And the sickle, of course, is very Druidic, symbol.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sickle is the Druids.
Yeah.
The hammer is the Masons.
Or even the Nordic Thor, right? A hammer of Thor.
Yes, absolutely. But it's also the gavel, and also you have to see that anyone who's really done their homework about communism, particularly I address people to the work of Yuri Lina, but also Eustace Mullins and G. Edward Griffin, or anyone who's actually studied communism knows how much Judaism played a part, or let's more correctly say Zionist played a part.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Okay. And therefore, that's why you have the Judaic star and you have the Judaic G, the Gaionim. This is a word that people have to read up on. I deal with it in the Irish Origins book. The Gaionim are the super secret elect, who are they're the descendants of the Gaionim. They're the descendants of the Levites, but these are people who preserved the teachings of the old Atonists, you see?
Absolutely. And then actually on top there, we talked about the G before. That's actually the fifth note of the regular scale, the G. And basically what you have at the star is the pentagram, the fifth note, you know. And
interesting. That makes sense to me, yeah.
It does, and even our own sun, I think, our own star, the scientists of our modern age classify that as a G star, you know. They have this different classifications, so it's all, you know, very much related here to industry, to science, and the same motif you see all over the place, basically.
You're saying they classified our planet or our sun?
Our sun is actually the G-class star.
How about that?
Yeah. So
we're talking solar cult here, and then we have the G.
Yeah, absolutely.
How about that?
So it's very, very interesting. And again, if we look at the next one, you know, we have the classic symbol of the lion and the British Israelite flag. You know, the Union of the Jack, rather. But you know, you can have your own interpretation of that if you want to. You know.
The Union Jack, the Red Cross of the Templars, and by the way, if they go to the Irish Origins website, and instead of clicking on appendices, go to excerpts. If you go to excerpts, you'll see a chapter called 41. People can read the whole chapter there. It's been put there as an excerpt from the book.
Right.
You'll see a section, an elaborate section on the Red Cross and where that comes from. That's also Egyptian.
Very interesting.
But of course, the lion is the Lion of Judah, not Judah. See, here's another one. Did you know that the Tudors, right, we're talking about the different Plantagenets and the different dynasties that are Atonist in nature?
Mm-hmm.
What happens if Tudor is a bad transliteration or bad rendering of Tuda, T-U-D-A?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or more correctly, Judah.
Ah.
Right? We have the Jacob,
yeah,
the Union Jack. What happens if the Tudor dynasty, tutors, the teachers, but what happens if it's a bad rendering of Judah, the Judites, the people sitting on the thrones of England, you see? The Atonist lion turns up on the original coronation throne, and it's still there today.
Right there at the bottom of it, yeah, absolutely.
And a pyramid at the top of the chair.
Yeah.
So the Queen of England is sitting is coronated on a throne that has a pyramid at the top and 4 Atonist lions on the bottom.
Yeah, and there she is.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. and then of course there is another interesting connection here to the Druids and the worship of the horns. Actually, if we look at the next image there, Fredrik, we can see an overhead of Buckingham Palace here, and Buckingham. Tell us about that word, Michael.
Yeah, it may be nothing, but you know, when you're into pattern recognition and the symbolism, you gotta keep your eyes sharpened. Like I said, it may be nothing, but the very fact that Buckingham has the word buck in it, a buck is a male deer.
Yeah, there you go.
But even if you don't buy into that, the very design of Buckingham Palace is identical to Washington, D.C., and it has the pyramid motif, the shape, the structure of the geomancy. You know, it's absolutely pyramidical in nature. The whole thing is riddled with symbolism. On the gates, even, on the gates of Buckingham Palace, you find the lion and the unicorn, which of course everyone knows is the Queen's standard, right? The British standard.
Right.
We've identified that the lion, which you see on the top of the left-hand pillar there, is the symbol of the old Atonists.
Mm-hmm.
But the unicorn, which is on the extreme right there,
the other side,
that is the symbol of the Ephraim. In biblical terms, it's the symbol of Ephraim.
Mm-hmm.
But the house of Ephraim is nothing more than the Levites who serve the Atonists. Remember, we said it's always it's a bipartisan thing going on here.
Yeah.
There's a double up of groups. So the Atonists are the elite. The Atonists are the oligarchs, right?
Yeah.
But they are very, very, very few in number, man. They need their arms and legs. They need their mercenaries. They need their lieutenants. They need their menials. When you see the unicorn, the pale white unicorn, that represents their lieutenants.
Mm. Good to know.
I'll be going into this. I go into this in the DVD, and it shows the origin of all of these symbols. But just the fact that it's laid out as identical to Washington, D.C., to the Capitol building and the White House, shows you who's running England. I mean, not who's running England, who's running America.
Well, there you go, exactly. I'm drawn back to, we don't have that image right now, but the image where the Queen is actually more centered, so to speak, almost taking the throne up there when Bush and Laura Bush is up there waving their hands. Do you see that? You know,
absolutely.
You know, when the Queen is taking the center stage there, you know, it's like
absolutely
who's in control here.
Here you have Britannia.
Yeah.
Britannia is it's a long story behind Britannia. I have a chapter on the role of the goddess in Volume 1. But Bharatana or Britannia goes originally back to Dana and to Bridget, right? The old megalithic goddesses of Ireland.
Ah.
Actually, what you're really seeing there is Eri, and in Sweden she's called Svea.
Svea, right? Yeah.
After whom after obviously is your country's named after.
Yeah.
The trident is also of Atlantis because the megalithic people were Atlanteans. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You have the shield of Britain. You have the maritime symbolism behind her, and you've got the lion of the pharaohs.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
Say about life, You gotta get together, tell yourself stories that violate every law of the universe, just to get through the goddamn day. What's that say about your reality, Marty?
When you get to talking like this, you sound panicked.
You figure it's all a scam, huh? All them folks? They just wrong.
Oh, yeah. Been that way since
One monkey looked at the sun and told the other monkey, he said, for you to give me your fucking share. People